For 4 years, the Western Front was defined by stalemate, by trenches, mud, and a grinding, agonizing war of attrition. But in the summer of 1918, the world finally saw what a breakthrough looked like. Today, we witness the Allied counterpunch, a coordinated, brilliant offensive where tanks, planes, and infantry moved as one, collapsing the German war machine and changing the strategic reality of the war, day by relentless day. This is the war that finally ended the war. This is the 100 Days Offensive. In the summer of 1918, after more than 4 years of brutal, grinding warfare, the First World War stood at a turning point. The German Spring Offensive, that desperate, all-or-nothing gamble to win the war before American reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers, had failed. Germany had thrown everything into one final series of attacks and had gained nothing but casualties and exhaustion. Now it was the Allies' turn. And in the 100 days that followed, from August 8 to November 11, 1918, the Allied armies would achieve what had seemed impossible for 4 long years. They would break the German army, shatter its will to fight, and end the Great War in decisive victory. This is the story of the 100 Days Offensive, the final, relentless campaign that won the First World War. To understand the 100 Days, one must first understand the strategic situation in the summer of 1918. The German Spring Offensive, launched in March and continuing through July, had achieved spectacular tactical success, advancing up to 40 miles, capturing over 90,000 prisoners, inflicting hundreds of thousands of casualties. But it had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The vital rail junction at Amiens remained in Allied hands. The channel ports that supplied the British Army remained secure. The British and French armies had not been separated. And most critically, the German army had exhausted itself, 680,000 casualties, its elite stormtrooper units decimated, its remaining divisions under strength and demoralized. Moreover, Germany now held a series of vulnerable salients, bulges in the front line that projected deep into Allied territory. These salients were difficult to defend, requiring more troops to hold the extended perimeter, and they were vulnerable to attack from multiple sides. The Germans had traded their carefully prepared defensive positions for exposed, indefensible ground, and they lacked the manpower to hold it properly. Meanwhile, the Allies were stronger than they had ever been. American troops were arriving at a rate of 250,000 per month. By August 1918, there were over 1 million American soldiers in France, with more arriving every week. The British and French armies, though they had suffered heavily in the spring, had been reinforced and reorganized. And critically, they had learned from their mistakes. The man who would orchestrate the final Allied victory was Marshal Foch, appointed Supreme Allied Commander in April 1918 during the crisis of the German Spring Offensive. Foch was 6 to 7 years old, a veteran of countless battles, and a commander who combined offensive spirit with tactical pragmatism. Foch understood that the Allies now held the initiative. Germany was exhausted, on the defensive, unable to replace its losses. But Foch also understood that a single massive offensive, like those that had characterized Allied strategy in 1916 and 1917, would simply allow the Germans to concentrate their reserves at the point of attack and inflict prohibitive casualties. Instead, Foch planned something different, a series of coordinated, rolling attacks by different Allied armies at different points along the front. The British would attack in one sector. Then, before the Germans could bring up reserves, the French would attack elsewhere. Then the Americans. Then the British again. Each attack would be limited in scope and duration, but together they would keep the Germans constantly off balance, unable to reinforce any single threatened sector, forced to use their dwindling reserves to plug holes rather than prepare counterattacks. But the key to the 100 Days was not just strategy, it was tactics. By 1918, the Allied armies had finally mastered the art of combined arms warfare, the coordination of infantry, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and cavalry, where terrain permitted, into a single, devastating offensive system. The artillery had learned to fire creeping barrages, curtains of shells that advanced at a walking pace just ahead of the infantry, suppressing enemy positions until the attackers were literally on top of them. Counter-battery fire had become precise, using sound ranging and aerial observation to locate and destroy German guns before they could fire on Allied infantry. Smoke shells could create artificial fog to conceal attacking forces. Tanks, which had first appeared in clumsy, unreliable numbers at the Somme in 1916, were now available in large numbers and improved designs. The British Mark V tank was faster, more reliable, and could cross wider trenches than its predecessors. The French Renault Foot was a light, agile tank that could support infantry attacks and exploit breakthroughs. By August 1918, the Allies had over 600 tanks available for offensive operations. Aircraft had evolved from reconnaissance platforms to fighters, bombers, and ground attack aircraft that could strafe enemy trenches and destroy supply columns. Allied air superiority meant that German movements could be observed and targeted, while Allied movements were shielded from German observation. And the infantry itself had changed. Gone were the rigid waves of 1916, walking slowly across no man's land. Allied infantry in 1918 moved in small, flexible units, using fire and movement tactics, carrying light machine guns and rifle grenades, trained to exploit opportunities rather than simply follow orders mechanically. Junior officers and NCOs had authority to make tactical decisions on the spot, allowing rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. All of these elements, artillery, tanks, aircraft, infantry, had to work together with precise timing. An attack would begin with a short, intense artillery bombardment. Then tanks would advance with the infantry immediately behind, using the tanks as mobile cover. Aircraft would strafe German positions and drop bombs on reserves moving forward. Within hours, breakthrough divisions would pass through the initial assault forces and drive deep into German rear areas, disrupting command and control. By early August 1918, Foch had selected the target for the first major offensive, Amiens. The Germans held a salient near the city, the result of their March offensive. This salient was exposed, vulnerable, and, critically, it threatened the vital rail junction. An attack here would not only eliminate the threat to Amiens but would demonstrate to the Germans, and to the world, that the Allies had seized the initiative and would not relinquish it. The attack was scheduled for August 8, 1918, and it would change everything. In the early morning darkness of August 8, 1918, along a front of approximately 15 miles east of the town of Amiens, an enormous Allied force prepared to attack. Over 400,000 men, British, Australian, Canadian, and French troops, waited in their assembly trenches. Behind them stood over 500 tanks, the largest concentration of armored vehicles ever assembled. And supporting them was an artillery force of nearly 2,000 guns, ready to deliver a devastating bombardment. The Germans suspected nothing. Unlike previous offensives, there had been no prolonged preliminary bombardment to warn the Germans an attack was coming. The movement of tanks and troops to the front had been done at night, with meticulous attention to secrecy. Aircraft engines were run at Allied airfields to mask the sound of tanks moving into position. Radio silence was strictly maintained. Even many Allied soldiers did not know they would be attacking until hours before 0 hour. At 4:20 a.m., without any warning bombardment, the attack began. The artillery barrage, when it came, was sudden and overwhelming. 2,000 guns opened fire simultaneously, targeting German artillery positions, command posts, and communication centers. There was no gradual build-up, just an instant hurricane of steel that caught the Germans completely by surprise. And then, through the morning mist that covered the battlefield, came the tanks. Over 500 of them, advancing in waves, crushing barbed wire, crossing trenches, suppressing machine gun positions. Behind them came the infantry, Australian and Canadian troops, widely recognized as the finest assault troops in the Allied armies, advancing in small groups, using cover, working with the tanks to neutralize German strongpoints. The German defense collapsed almost immediately. Units that were used to holding positions against frontal infantry assaults found themselves facing an entirely different form of warfare. Tanks appeared out of the mist, impervious to rifle and machine gun fire. Artillery shells crashed down with devastating accuracy. Infantry bypassed strongpoints that would have held up attacks for hours in previous offensives, leaving them to be reduced by follow-on forces or tanks. By midday, Allied forces had advanced 7 miles, an astonishing distance by Western Front standards, where advances were typically measured in yards. German units surrendered in large numbers. Entire battalions were overrun or surrounded. Supply dumps, artillery positions, and headquarters were captured. The German defensive system was not merely penetrated, it was shattered. General Erich Ludendorff, the effective commander of the German army, received reports of the disaster at Amiens with shock and despair. In his memoirs, he would later call August 8, 1918, the Black Day of the German army. Not because of the casualties, though they were severe, around 27,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured on that single day, but because of what the collapse revealed about the state of German morale and fighting capacity. German soldiers were surrendering in unprecedented numbers, not because they were surrounded or out of ammunition, but because they no longer believed the war could be won. Officers reported that reserves being moved up to the front were jeered at by retreating troops, called war prolongers and worse. The will to fight, which had sustained the German army through 4 years of war, was breaking. But the Allies did not pause to consolidate their gains at Amiens. This was the genius of Foch's strategy. On August 10th, before the Germans could fully recover from the shock of Amiens, French forces launched a new attack further south. On August 21st, British forces attacked near Albert. On August 26th, British and Canadian forces struck north of Arras. Each attack achieved significant gains. Each forced the Germans to commit reserves. Each widened the offensive front. The Germans could not respond effectively because they could not predict where the next blow would fall. As soon as they concentrated forces to contain one attack, another would begin elsewhere. They were being kept constantly off balance, always reacting, never able to seize the initiative. Through late August and early September, the pattern continued. Attack after attack, sector after sector, the Allies drove the Germans back. The salients created by the German spring offensive were eliminated. Territory that Germany had captured at enormous cost in March and April was retaken in days with relatively light casualties. The Germans were being pushed back not just to their starting positions, but beyond them, back toward the heavily fortified defensive system they had spent 2 years constructing, the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line, known to the Germans as the Siegfriedstellung, was the most formidable defensive system on the Western Front. Constructed in 1916 and 1917, it consisted of multiple defensive belts stretching back several miles in depth. Deep concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, extensive barbed wire obstacles, and defensive positions carefully sited to maximize the advantages of terrain. The Germans had withdrawn to this line in early 1917, giving up territory to shorten their front and make it nearly impregnable. If the Germans could hold the Hindenburg Line, they might stabilize the front, buy time for negotiations, perhaps salvage something from the war. Breaking the Hindenburg Line, conversely, would mean breaking the back of German resistance entirely. The assault on the Hindenburg Line began in late September 1918 with a series of carefully coordinated attacks along its entire length. This was combined arms warfare at its most sophisticated. The lessons of 4 years of war, the hard-won experience of countless failed offensives, all came together in a masterpiece of operational planning and execution. On September 26th, American and French forces attacked in the Meuse-Gorne sector. On September 27th, British and Belgian forces attacked in Flanders. On September 28th, British forces attacked toward Cambrai. And on September 29th, British and Australian forces launched the main assault toward the most heavily fortified section of the Hindenburg Line near the Street Quentin Canal. The attack on the St. Quentin Canal was entrusted to the Australian Corps and the American II Corps, fighting alongside British divisions. Their objective was to cross the canal, itself a formidable obstacle with steep sides and deep water, and break through the defensive positions beyond. It was considered one of the most difficult objectives of the entire war. The attack began before dawn on September 29th with a massive artillery barrage. Then came the infantry and tanks, advancing through morning fog toward the canal. In some places, the canal ran through a tunnel, and Allied troops were able to cross on top of the tunnel. In other places, they had to cross on improvised bridges or wade through the water under heavy fire. The fighting was intense, but the Allied troops pressed forward with a determination and skill that the Germans could not match. Australian and American soldiers worked together to reduce German strong points. Tanks provided mobile firepower, suppressing defensive positions. Artillery support was precisely coordinated with the infantry advance. Within hours, the Allies had established bridgeheads across the canal. By the end of the day, they had broken through the main line of the Hindenburg defenses. The Hindenburg Line, the position that was supposed to be impregnable, that had been built to hold for years if necessary, had been broken in one day. Through October, the Allied advance continued with relentless momentum. Town after town, village after village fell to Allied forces. Cambrai was liberated on October 8th. Le Cateau on October 10th. Lille, the largest city in northern France under German occupation, was evacuated by the Germans on October 17th and entered by British forces the next day. The population emerged from 4 years of occupation to greet their liberators with joy and tears. The Germans were not routing, they were conducting a fighting retreat, contesting ground, making the Allies pay for every mile. But they were retreating nonetheless, steadily, inexorably, giving up all the territory they had held for 4 years. And it was not just the British and Dominion forces achieving these victories. The French armies, written off as finished after the mutinies of 1917, had rebuilt themselves and were now advancing with renewed vigor. French forces pushed forward in the Aisne Valley, recaptured Lane on October 13th, and drove the Germans back toward the Belgian frontier. The Belgian army, which had held a small corner of unoccupied Belgium for 4 years, now advanced alongside British and French forces in Flanders, liberating Belgian territory village by village. King Albert I of Belgium personally led his troops forward, the only monarch on either side to command troops at the front throughout the war. The coordination between these different armies, British, French, Belgian, American, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, South African, was unprecedented in military history. Foch's system of rolling attacks meant that each army supported the others, preventing the Germans from concentrating against any single thrust. When one army encountered heavy resistance and its advance slowed, another army's attack would threaten the flank of the German positions, forcing them to withdraw. This was not the isolated, poorly coordinated offensives of earlier years. This was modern coalition warfare, with multiple armies working together toward a common objective with a level of coordination that had never been achieved before. By late October, the question was no longer whether the Allies would win, but when. The German army was still fighting, still capable of local counterattacks, still dangerous. But it was clearly, visibly disintegrating. Desertion rates were climbing. Entire divisions surrendered with minimal resistance. German soldiers were increasingly asking, "What are we fighting for?" when victory was clearly impossible. But the Allies were not fighting alone. By October 1918, there was another army on the Western Front, an army that would bring overwhelming numbers, tremendous material resources, and fresh energy to the final campaign. The American Expeditionary Force had arrived in force, and it was about to make its presence felt decisively. The 100 Days Offensive was not just a British and French victory. It was an Allied victory in the truest sense, a coalition effort where armies from across the world came together to achieve what none could have achieved alone. And in the final weeks of the war, the American contribution would prove crucial to bringing the conflict to its conclusion. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, the American army numbered fewer than 130,000 men, smaller than the Belgian army, tiny compared to the millions under arms in Europe. America had enormous potential, vast population, enormous industrial capacity, unlimited resources, but turning that potential into military power would take time. By the autumn of 1918, that transformation was complete. Over 2 million American soldiers had arrived in France, with more coming every day. The American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John J. Pershing, had become one of the largest and most powerful armies on the Western Front. The American contribution to the war effort went far beyond manpower. American industry produced steel, munitions, food, and supplies in quantities that dwarfed what the exhausted European economies could provide. American loans kept the British and French war efforts funded. American merchant ships carried supplies across the Atlantic, replacing the vessels sunk by German U-boats. In every aspect of modern, industrial warfare, American resources were proving decisive. But it was the soldiers themselves, the doughboys, as they were called, who would make the most direct impact on the war's final outcome. The American soldiers of 1918 were different from their European counterparts. They had not endured 4 years of trench warfare. They had not witnessed the slaughter of the Somme or Verdun or Passchendaele. They were fresh, confident, sometimes overly aggressive, and they brought an energy to the battlefield that contrasted sharply with the war-weary cynicism of veteran European troops. General Pershing insisted that American forces fight as an independent army, under American command, rather than being dispersed as replacements in British and French units. This was partly national pride, partly a recognition that America's contribution would be forgotten if its soldiers fought under foreign flags. Foch and the other Allied commanders resisted initially. They wanted American troops immediately fed into existing formations. But Pershing held firm, and by September 1918, the American First Army was ready for independent operations. The Americans' first major independent operation was the reduction of the St. Mihiel salient, a German-held bulge in the line south of Verdun that had existed since 1914. In mid-September, over 550,000 American troops, supported by French artillery and Allied aircraft, attacked the salient from 2 sides. The attack, launched on September 12, 1918, was a complete success. American troops advanced rapidly, capturing over 15,000 German prisoners and eliminating the salient within 4 days. The Germans, already overstretched elsewhere on the front, offered only limited resistance. They had been planning to evacuate the salient anyway, and the American attack simply accelerated their timeline. But the real test of American combat effectiveness would come in the Meuse-Gorne offensive, the largest and costliest operation ever undertaken by the United States Army, before or since. The Meuse-Gorne sector was one of the most heavily fortified areas on the Western Front. The Germans had spent 4 years developing its defenses. The terrain was difficult, dense forests, steep ridges, and the Meuse River providing natural obstacles. And the sector was strategically vital. An Allied breakthrough here would threaten the critical German railway line that ran through Mezieres and Sedan, severing the main German supply route to the Western Front. The Meuse-Gorne offensive began on September 26, 1918, with over 1 million American soldiers participating, more Americans in combat than had fought in the entire Civil War. The initial assault achieved significant success, advancing several miles and overrunning German defensive positions. But then the advance slowed as American troops encountered increasingly stubborn resistance. The fighting in the Meuse-Gorne was brutal. Dense forests made coordination difficult. German machine gun nests, positioned on high ground, commanded the approaches. American artillery support, while massive in quantity, was often inaccurate due to inexperienced crews. American infantry tactics, while aggressive, were sometimes costly. The doughboys had courage in abundance but lacked the hard-won tactical sophistication of veteran British or French units. American casualties were heavy. In the first month of the Meuse-Gorne offensive alone, American losses exceeded 100,000, killed, wounded, missing. Individual actions, like the famous exploit of Sergeant Alvin York, who single-handedly captured 132 German prisoners on October 8, became legendary. But behind the individual heroism was a grinding, attritional battle that consumed American units as rapidly as they could be fed into the line. Yet the Americans kept coming. When divisions were exhausted, fresh divisions replaced them. When casualties mounted, replacements arrived from training camps in the United States. The American army had what the German army lacked: depth. Reserves behind reserves behind reserves, seemingly inexhaustible. For the Germans facing this onslaught, the psychological impact was devastating. They had held the Western Front for 4 years against the British and French. They had survived the Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele. They had launched their own offensives in the spring of 1918 that had nearly won the war. But now they faced not just the British and French, but Americans as well, millions of them, with more arriving constantly. German soldiers could do the math. Even if they won every tactical engagement, even if they inflicted heavier casualties than they received, they were doomed. The Allies could replace their losses indefinitely. Germany could not. It was simply a matter of time. And morale, which had been deteriorating since the failure of the spring offensive, now collapsed entirely. German soldiers surrendered in increasing numbers. Desertion became epidemic, men simply walking away from the front, heading home, declaring the war over whether officially or not. Officers reported that their men would fight defensively but refused to participate in counterattacks. The offensive spirit that had characterized the German army since 1914 was gone. The German High Command could see what was happening. On October 2nd, Ludendorff, meeting with German political leaders, declared that Germany must seek an immediate armistice. Not a negotiated peace, an armistice, a ceasefire, before the military situation deteriorated further. The army could not hold much longer. If the Allies continued their offensive through the winter, Germany would face complete military collapse and possibly invasion. By late October, the situation on the Western Front was clear. The German army was retreating along the entire front. American forces in the Meuse Gorne were gradually grinding forward, getting closer to the vital German rail lines. British and Dominion forces were liberating northern France and pushing into Belgium. French forces were advancing toward the German frontier. The Belgians were reclaiming their country. The end of the war was not just probable, it was imminent. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how many more would die before the fighting finally stopped. Through October and into early November, the Allied advance continued. Town by town, village by village, sometimes mile by mile, always forward, never back. The German army was not routed, it maintained cohesion, conducted fighting retreats, occasionally counterattacked. But it was clearly, visibly, a defeated army conducting a retreat to nowhere, buying time for an armistice that its political leaders were desperately trying to negotiate. And behind the front lines, in Germany itself, the foundations of the state were crumbling. The war that had begun in August 1914 with such confidence and enthusiasm was about to end in revolution, collapse, and defeat. In late October and early November 1918, as Allied armies advanced along the Western Front, the German home front was disintegrating. 4 years of war, 4 years of the Allied blockade, 4 years of increasing food shortages, and now the clear evidence that Germany had lost the war, all of this created a perfect storm of political and social collapse. On October 29th, sailors in the German High Seas Fleet at Kiel mutinied when ordered to sail out for a final, suicidal battle against the British Royal Navy. The mutiny spread rapidly, becoming a full-scale revolution. Workers' and soldiers' councils formed in cities across Germany, demanding an end to the war and the abdication of the Kaiser. The political and military authorities, who had ruled Germany for 4 years as an effective military dictatorship, lost control of the situation. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had been the symbol of German military power, who had presided over the outbreak of war in 1914 and Germany's initial victories, now faced a choice: abdicate or risk civil war. On November 9, 1918, he abdicated and fled to neutral Holland, where he would live in exile until his death in 1941. A republic was proclaimed in Berlin, and the new civilian government took on the responsibility of negotiating an armistice, a task the military leadership had proved unwilling or unable to complete. Ludendorff himself had already resigned on October 26, unable to accept responsibility for the defeat and unwilling to negotiate the armistice. His replacement, General Wilhelm Gruner, recognized that the war was lost and that further fighting would only lead to more German casualties and possibly the complete occupation of Germany by Allied forces. German delegates crossed the front lines under a flag of truce on November 7 and were taken to Marshal Foch's headquarters, a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, northeast of Paris. There, they met with Foch and representatives of the Allied powers to discuss terms for an armistice. The terms presented to the Germans were harsh but not negotiable. Germany must evacuate all occupied territories: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine. Germany must surrender enormous quantities of military equipment: 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, 2,000 aircraft, 5,000 locomotives, and 150,000 railway cars. The Allied blockade would continue until a final peace treaty was signed, and the Allies would occupy German territory west of the Rhine River as a guarantee. The German delegates protested, argued that the terms were too severe, that Germany was being treated as a conquered nation. But Foch was unmoved. Germany had sued for an armistice. These were the terms. Accept them or the war would continue, and Allied armies would advance deeper into Germany. On the morning of November 11, 1918, the German delegates signed the armistice agreement. The ceasefire would take effect at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. 6 hours notice to allow word to reach all units on the front. At the front, when word came that the armistice would take effect at 11 a.m., reactions were mixed. Some units celebrated immediately, soldiers embracing, cheering, weeping with relief that they had survived. Others were more subdued, cautious, unwilling to believe it was really over until the appointed hour arrived. And tragically, the fighting continued right up until 11 a.m. Some commanders, unwilling to see their men be the last to die in a war that was already over, ceased fire early. Others, determined to follow orders literally or perhaps seeking one last tactical advantage, continued attacking until the final minute. Men died at 10:55 a.m., at 10:58, at 10:59. The last British soldier killed in action died at 10:58. An American soldier was killed at 10:59. At 11 a.m., all along the Western Front, the guns fell silent. After 1,568 days of continuous warfare, the killing stopped. Soldiers emerged from trenches and looked across no man's land at enemies who were no longer shooting. In some places, men simply sat down where they were, exhausted beyond words. In others, cautious meetings occurred, British and German soldiers meeting in no man's land, exchanging cigarettes or souvenirs, sometimes speaking to each other, sometimes simply standing in silence. The Great War, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914, that had consumed a generation, that had killed over 10 million soldiers and perhaps 10 million civilians, was over. The 100 Days Offensive had achieved what 4 years of previous offensives had failed to accomplish. It had broken the German army, liberated occupied territories, and forced Germany to accept an armistice on Allied terms. The statistics tell the story. Between August 8 and November 11, Allied forces had advanced up to 70 miles, captured over 385,000 German prisoners, and inflicted approximately 420,000 German casualties. Allied casualties were also heavy, approximately 1.1 million across all Allied armies, but the difference was that the Allies could sustain these losses while Germany could not. But the 100 Days Offensive left an ambiguous legacy, particularly in Germany. Because the German army had retreated but had not been destroyed, because Allied forces had not yet crossed into Germany proper when the armistice took effect, because the German army marched home in relatively good order rather than as a disorganized rabble. A dangerous myth took hold in Germany in the years after the war. This was the stab-in-the-back myth, the claim that the German army had been undefeated in the field, that it had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, and revolutionaries at home who had sued for peace while victory was still possible. This myth ignored the clear evidence that the German army had been comprehensively defeated during the 100 Days, that it had been driven back along the entire front, that its defensive lines had been broken, that its soldiers were surrendering in unprecedented numbers, that its high command had declared the war unwinnable. The stab-in-the-back myth would poison German politics for years, contributing to the rise of extremism and eventually to the outbreak of another, even more catastrophic war just 21 years later. It was a lie, but it was a lie that many Germans wanted to believe because it allowed them to avoid confront. The 100 Days offensive was not one battle, but a continuous chain of victories. It was the triumph of Allied coordination, superior logistics, and the integrated use of new technology. It shattered the German army and forced their high command to accept the inevitable. The signing of the armistice at 5 a.m. on November 11th brought the fighting to an official close at 11 o'clock. 4 years of slaughter silenced by a single document. But the victory was complicated. For those at home, the myth of the stab in the back would soon take root, obscuring the decisive defeat inflicted by the Allies in the field. The guns were silent. But the conflicts this victory created would echo for a generation. If you want to understand the monumental forces that win wars and reshape the future, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, which Allied force, the British, the French, or the Americans, do you believe delivered the most decisive blow of the 100 Days offensive? Thanks for watching.